Welcome everyone. Today we're going to have Paul Glevy talk to us about field management and how we can implement that as graduate students. So let's welcome Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. So as you can see from the slide, this is not really up to date in some sense. For those of you who've taken my impact evaluation course, the book is actually based on these presentations that were made in China and South Africa. And so included in the back of the book, which I think is why people ask me to present this, is chapters on these topics. And so we presented them in China and South Africa, but we didn't present them in my class just because there's not enough time unless the students ask for it. Okay, so there's two actually sets of slides here. The first one here is on data collection and data management, as you can see. And the next one will be on sort of survey, field work, and stuff like that. Okay. Well, almost always when you do field work impact evaluations, you're going to be collecting new data. And if you're doing, evaluating a program, which is what the slides are about, you're talking about we have treated people and controlled people. Well, as you probably know, since you came here, that data collection management is important, and you have to really organize it very well. In this set of slides, we're really talking about a kind of a pretty big operation. And so if you're just doing this all by yourself, you're going to have to do everything yourself. But this is kind of assuming that you've got more. And basically there's this conflict whenever you're doing data collection between timeliness, getting the data you want, relatively quickly so you can evaluate the program or do whatever research you want to do soon, and also data quality, because, basically, doing things that improve data quality can slow you down. And so you have to kind of balance these two things. Okay. So, and here we're going to kind of go through in chronological order how to organize data collection. Okay. So, basically to take a big picture view here, the first thing you do is sort of set up procedures for collecting the data, and then you actually go out and collect the data, and then you check the data quality. So that's sort of the big picture here. Okay. Oh, there's actually some more things here. Then you have to, after you check the data for quality, you're going to create these files for analysis, and in some cases, dissemination. I mean, the way we were doing this course was that, the data would be used by lots of people, and so we want to have disseminate. But even now, if you're just doing it for your own research, many journals will require you to post the data and make it, available. So you'll have to do that anyways. And so then you need to store it. Now, there's a lot of different ways. Now, again, given that this was written like 10, 12 years ago, there's a lot of technological things that have happened in the last 10 or 12 years that are not going to be in these slides. So feel free to interrupt me with questions if anything comes up here. And again, apologies if it's a little out of date in terms of technology. Okay. All right, so let's start with the first step, establishing procedures for data collection and managing the data. I mean, first, if you've got sufficient funds, ideally you set up a team to do things. And so the first thing during data collection is set up a data manager type person who will oversee all the sort of steps in collecting the data and checking it and so forth. And so this ideally, if you've got the funding, you'll choose a data manager. In fact, if you have even more money, you might want to have two data managers or co-managers. And one of these will be somebody, if you're doing this for the government, somebody in the organization that's managing the research project, like I do stuff with education. So that would be somebody in the Ministry of Education. And then another one would be an outsider who's more of an expert, a consultant type person who knows a lot more about how to conduct these, has a lot of experience. Okay, so if you can afford it, get a data manager. The next thing you need to do is draw the sample, okay? If you're just, collecting data on a cross-section of people, you need to draw the sample, but sometimes if you're doing an impact evaluation, you're drawing the sample and you're dividing the population into treatment control is like the same step, okay? So for RCTs or randomized experiments, you can basically say, okay, I'm going to do say there's this population of 1,000 or maybe 10,000 schools. I'm going to randomly collect data from 200 and half of them will be treated and half will be controlled. So drawing the sample, if you're doing an RCT, kind of can be combined with actually doing the randomization of assignment of whatever the units are to treatment or controls. Okay. And then if you're not doing an RCT, then you have this larger population of households. And actually, even if you are doing, well, even with an RCT or non-RCT, the sometimes if you're looking at a program, it's a kind of a rare that people participated. So you need to, statistically speaking, it's good to have like half of your sample be treated and half control. But the population you may have, maybe only 3% are treated and the rest are control. So you may oversample the treated people and undersample, I guess, the sort of control people. And then you need to use special statistical methods because this is called the choice-based sampling. And you need to see some other references there. But this is just something to keep in mind. Okay. Sometimes also you're going to merge your data with data from some other source. For example, in some stuff I'm doing now in Morocco, we're getting some data from the Ministry of Education, but we're also collecting our own data, visiting schools and so forth. And so you need to merge the data. The first step is to get permission from the government or whoever it is that has the data to use it, which is not always easy. We're facing that in Morocco almost every week. But you need to get permission, and then you need to sort of link the data with some kind of ID codes or something like this. And for example, if you're doing school data, in some countries, they give each school a unique code. And so when you collect your data, you need to get that unique code for the schools you're working with. And you need to link it with the government data on those schools, you use that ID code to link the two data sets. Okay. And sometimes if you're looking at personal information, I mean, you're sampling people instead of like schools, there may be some unique national ID numbers. Like in the US, we have social security numbers. Other countries have these things, but these things can be very sensitive. Okay. You have to not, take very careful steps to make sure that you're not leaking out anybody's ID codes. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But ideally, you'd have to, if you want a matching, you'll have to have some kind of ID code of some type to match your data with data from another organization. Okay. Data entry. This has changed a lot over the past few years. 20 years ago, people were mainly using questionnaires, paper questionnaires, and then they would, take the questionnaires and sit down and type in like you see on this picture. I should point out that, my lectures rarely have pictures, but the World Bank people really wanted us to have lots of pictures in these when we presented this in China and South Africa. So anyways, going back to data entry, they used to do it while you'd get paper questionnaires and somebody type it in, but now more and more people are using iPads or laptops or some other digital device, even a phone, to punch the data in when the data is being collected. Okay. If you're still doing it the old way, you want to check it as soon as possible. In fact, often what you do, whether you have the old way or the new way, your data entry program would have kind of checks of the data that can happen automatically to get contradictory data. If somebody says in the beginning, there are 5 people in this household, and then later on you're collecting information and you realize there's maybe more than 5 people, then you have to go back and fix it. And so data entry programs can pick all these things. They can also pick out, strange numbers like really huge amounts of food consumption, some minor food item, or other kind of inconsistencies like somebody says that this person is like in school, but the person's 40 years old. Okay, that's another inconsistency. So these data entry programs, whether you're doing it the old way or the new way, you want to put in a lot of checks in the software to check for contradictory data or just kind of very implausible data. Okay. And if you do it the old-fashioned way where you go and interview somebody and then you come back and do the data entry, you want to do that really fast so that if you find these mistakes, you can go back to the person, back to the household and try to clarify what's going on. If you wait, a few weeks, you're probably left the area. You can't go back and fix the problems. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I think I've said all these things already. Yeah, and then you have storage areas, and also there's this whole issue of like once you get the data on your particular device of transmitting it to a larger data storage area. Okay, This software, I think, is pretty much out of date. Okay, this is, some things that done. I think people now use Survey CTO a lot, but there's other software out there for doing this. Okay. Yeah, and you want the software if you're actually doing, well, that's kind of a trade-off here. If you're collecting data on a digital device right when you're interviewing somebody, one thing you might have the software do is like, beep if somebody gives something in some inconsistent data, and then right away, oh, I need to go back and figure out what's going on. But sometimes people don't like the beeps, that you're interviewing. So maybe, instead of a beep, maybe it flashes something on the screen that the person won't see. Okay. Um, okay, let's see. Yeah, so there's four kinds of checks you can put into the data here to look for inconsistencies. One is range checks. I mean, a very simple one is the age. If you're getting people more than 100 years old, probably there's been a typo or something like this. Range checks on income and on if you collect height and weight data. The range checks on food consumption. There's lots of things that you can do. Making sure a person who's 10 years old shouldn't say, I've had 10 years of education or something. There's lots of things like that. Then there can be checks against reference tables like anthropometric data. That's data where you collect height and weight of people and you check, is this height and weight data consistent? I mean, there is a certain amount of variation that's normal, but you could have some really tall people or really short people, or maybe the height and the weight, they just don't match. So there's a whole bunch of ways you can check that. And then in many questionnaires, you have these skip codes where if you answer like no to one question, you'll skip a few questions and go on to something else that's relevant. And so you can check whether the skip codes have actually been followed or not. Okay. Actually, you can build that in automatically into the software if you're just doing the data entry in person. But sometimes there's a reason not to follow the skip code. So you allow the interviewer to override the skip code. Okay. Because of some unforeseen thing. Okay, and then mutually inconsistent data, I've talked about that already, like, the age and your years of schooling may not make sense and so forth. Okay. And so ideally what you do here when you're putting together your data entry program is that when you do a pilot test, which we'll talk about a little more later, you're trying out your questionnaire. You also do pilot test the data entry system to see that it's working correctly. It's amazing how many things can go wrong. And I mean, usually a pilot test is a very depressing thing to do because you find out that like your questions are not working right and all kinds of things are not working. Yeah, Ryan.
I was going to ask you about your experience with piloting. How do you select the group that is the pilot of your bigger subset?
Yeah.
What are you, in your experience, particularly looking for, like, as you go through pilots?
Yeah. I mean, for a general household survey, you try to get urban, rural people, your big population that you're sampling from, you try to make sure you pilot it in different areas. But there's kind of like this trade-off here. Usually in the pilot, you're not going to go all over the country if you're doing a nationwide data collection. It may not be affordable. So you try to go to a few places. So that's one thing. In terms of the numbers, I would think if you're doing a household survey, 100 or 150 households spread around is probably enough to pick up the big things. But yeah, again, try do it in urban areas, rural areas, and so forth, and try to go a little bit around the country as much as you can afford. Let's see what else. Is there anything else you want to ask about that? Yeah. So that's kind of what we've usually been doing. And same thing with schools. Actually, with schools, we do a little lower, like 50 schools or something like this to see what happens, but try to spread them out. Okay. Okay. Now, you're going to have interviewers and maybe supervisors helping you collect the data. And so you need to have a training program so that they kind of, do it a good job. Sometimes there are organizations already in the countries that have good interviewers and supervisors, like IPA has offices in many countries, and I'm using them in Sierra Leone. We didn't really have to do any special training, but other times you're going to get people who really don't have much experience. So you're going to have to do the training. Okay. And first of all, the training in terms of scheduling, we'll talk about schedule a little bit later. In terms of scheduling, you want to do the interview training very close before the data collection started, because if you do it like a month and then they have a month of time in between the training and the data collection, they're going to forget a lot of stuff. Okay. And so try to get it as close as you can to when the data are collected. Um, and the training, I don't know if we're going to go into that, how much detail. Um, there's sort of like two parts to the training. There's like classroom training where you go through the questionnaire or whatever it is, kind of data collecting, so they understand like what's going on. And then there's like practice interviewing that they do out in the field. Okay. Um, so there's sort of two sets to the training there. So here's a few bullet points on, what you should do with training. First of all, the interviewers going to need to understand what's going on, why you're asking these questions, because if they think, oh, this question is not very useful, they may not do a good job. So ideally, they would, understand what's going on with every question, and certainly every section, what the purposes of it is. Okay. And everybody needs to understand what the goal of the whole evaluation or data collection is. And they also need to, if it's an experiment, they should know, let's see. And they should kind of know about the randomization, and, what the control group would expect. Actually, I'm trying to remember what the point, there was something about that. Understanding the intervention that's being evaluated. Okay. One big issue in terms of data collection is, do you pay, if you're doing a household survey, do you pay the household members some gift, okay, to make sure that, they cooperate? Because a big problem with household surveys is people refuse to participate. It's not so big in developing countries, especially rural areas, but in urban areas, a lot of people they just don't want to be interviewed. So try to entice them, you say, okay, we're going to give you a little money, or we're going to give you, some nice little gift or something like this. This varies a lot across countries. Some countries do not want to do it because they say, look, if we don't do that in our country, and if you start doing it, then we're going to have to start doing it, and that's going to be a big headache for us. On the other hand, it may actually increase cooperation, and reduce attrition if you're collecting panel data. So this is a big thing, but the people need to be clear about, are they getting something or not? Sometimes people will ask you, hey, do I get something or not? The interviewers need to know whether they are going to be giving something. This is a big question that's kind of country specific, whether you can do it or not. There's pros and cons of this sort of thing. Okay, obviously you want the interviewers to be polite and respectful of the respondents, and to get the households to cooperate, or the whatever you're collecting, the firms to cooperate. You need to get everybody to be polite and respectful. You might use some mass media to sort of publicize this. And surveys I did a long time ago in Ghana, and I think in Vietnam, there were nationwide surveys. There was like television and radio ads telling people that they were collecting data, please cooperate. So they kind of know that this is a legitimate thing and it's not some kind of scam or something like this. Mm-hmm. And getting cooperation from local authorities. You're going somewhere like to some town or rural area, you need in many countries to talk to the local, government people to make sure to first kind of tell them, we're going to be working in your area, we're not some kind of suspicious organization or something like this. Okay. Considering giving incentives to households to cooperate, that's a big, difficult thing to decide. I don't have a strong opinion either way. And then sometimes in some countries, you need to have appropriate interviewers, like maybe only women can interview women, especially if you're asking about fertility questions and things like this, or domestic, violence or things like this. So they need special training in some circumstances for certain topics. Okay, so that was all about preparing to collect the data. Now, what about actual collecting of the data? Basically, when you go into the field, hopefully everything is, you have a good questionnaire by that point and other good data collection items. Even before that, you should develop a kind of a schedule of field work. Okay, where's everybody going to be? Where are the households, or where are the schools, or where are the firms that you're going to located? And this, of course, depends on the sample size, which is power calculations and so forth like this. There's lots of things to organize, like transportation and lodging of people. If they're going far out, they may have to stay overnight and, go out someplace for a week. Okay. to move them around. So just a few points about this. If you're doing an RCT, it's important that the data collection for the control group and the treated group is about the same time. An example of this that I had when I was doing evaluating an RCT in Honduras is they didn't do it at the same time. They were looking at school enrollment. And so for like the treated people, they interviewed them during the harvest time when the kids would sometimes get pulled out of school. But for the control group, they interviewed them at another time when there wasn't really much work for them to do. So the comparison was really kind of messed up. I haven't mentioned much about supervisors, but it's very important to have supervisors who check on the interviewer's work. In extreme cases, you're going to have one supervisor for every two interviewers, but one for every 3 or 4 could be enough. And what do? The supervisors, they watch the interviewers doing their work, making sure that they're kind of doing the things they were instructed to do in their training. Then they check completed questionnaires, either electronic or to see that they're, fully filled out and completely corrected. And then randomly re-interview a few households or whatever, the firms or whatever, to make sure that, they've counted everybody and so forth. I mean, there's always this worry that an interviewer, like instead of going to the household to do the interview, will just decide it's too much it's too far away or something, too much trouble. So they just kind of go somewhere and just make up imaginary data. And this, by re-interviewing households, you can find out whether that's what they're doing. They never went there. Brian?
So I've had that problem in the past where we would catch somebody and then go to like a pub and drink and make up stories.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, going through that process, it's hard to figure that out. So have you, in your experience, found ways where you can kind of tease out fraud or people making up information?
Yeah, it's kind of tricky. I mean, one way to see it is if the questionnaire is filled out in such a way that like nothing's happening. Like you ask them, do you have a business? Do you have a farm? And they say, no, no, no. I mean, the interviewer does this because he knows that if he says no, 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 then there's less to fill out. Okay. So like lack of information or small numbers of household members and things like that. But really the best way is like to go back and re-interview like 10% of the households. And if somebody's doing this, you'll catch it pretty quickly. There may be some ways that you can look at the data to see for some other suspicious patterns, like some households that look very similar to each other from the same interviewer. Yeah, I mean, generally it depends. I mean, there may be ways of like looking at data patterns and interviewer fixed effects, and you find that there's one interviewer who's like doing things very different from everybody else. That may be a sign that there's something suspicious going on. Yeah. I guess the other thing is to have these supervisors with the interviewers as much as possible to like actually watch them do the work. Okay. Okay. And then even the supervisors need to be supervised. So you have like the higher up people, maybe you, who will check also the work of the supervisors. I remember once in Ghana a long time ago, this one supervisor, they were filling out forms, like checking questionnaires, and he checked like everything was right. There was nothing ever wrong. So I thought that was pretty suspicious. So then I got some of those questionnaires, looked at them, and I found that there really were some things wrong, and clearly he'd never checked. So you need to also like supervise the supervisors. Okay. Checking data quality. Yeah, and you're in the field, there's several things you can do. Hopefully the data entry program will do it, but often it doesn't. Let's see. If you're doing the paper questionnaires and going to take them back to some laptop computer somewhere, you need to do that quickly so that you can go back to the households or whatever it is to fix the problems before you move on to another area where you're collecting the data. Okay. Yeah, so there also, you often find that when even though you've done a very good job of pilot testing the questionnaires and the data entry program, you'll find out in the real survey that there's still some problems with the questionnaire or the data entry program. So you may need to give some new instructions saying, okay, for this question, we need to change it or something like this. Now with more things being more electronically done, that's easy. You just sort of send them, here's the new data entry program. It's got the new fixed up questions and it's fixed up the data entry program and so forth. But that happens a lot. So just if you find you'll often get feedback from the interviewers or other people saying something is not working. This question, people don't understand it, or that the possible answers aren't really the right ones. So you'll get feedback right away, and so you need to be prepared to make those changes quickly. Yeah, and then if there's something that's really troublesome, the sort of top management needs to figure out what to do. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Okay, that was data quality in the field. When you get out of the field, you can do more checks. One thing that is amazing how often it happens is duplicate households or duplicate firms or schools or something. You have this, each one is supposed to have a separate ID code, and then you have like two households with the same ID code, and they're clearly not the same household, or two schools or two health clinics. Okay, so go through, it's easy to do in Stata and other software. Go through and just check whether there are some units, households, or whatever they are that have the same ID codes. Okay, it's a common, somebody typed in the wrong number or something like this, and you see it. Okay, and then you sometimes it's because the same household is in their data set twice, and you see it's really the same, so you just take one out. But other times it's a different household, and then you try to go back and check to see what happens. And if you can't ever figure out exactly what happened, you'll probably have to drop both of those households. Because something weird happened. Okay. You can also, and again, after you're back out of the field, look at key variables that you want to check, income or total expenditure, or maybe food consumption, things like this, and look for outliers, strange values. One thing I used to do a lot in a survey in Vietnam is we asked people how much they spent on a certain food item and how much they the physical quantity in kilograms. So we calculate a simple price with that, and then we check the distribution of that price data. And sometimes you get some really big outliers, and clearly something went wrong with either the food, the quantity, or the expenditure. Okay, and sometimes what I would do then, if like there's some kind of insignificant food item where they say, okay, I spent a lot of money on it, probably what I'll do is just like toss that out and set it to 0. Okay. The only other alternative is to throw out the entire household, which I may not be willing to do for such a trivial food item. Okay. And sometimes if you've got paper questionnaires, maybe the problem was that the person who entered the data really made a mistake, and you go look at the paper questionnaires and see, it was like a typo or something like this. Okay. If you're collecting panel data, so there's previous data from the same households or whatever it is, then you can check to see, like, are the same people still there? They have the same dates of birth and stuff like this to make sure that there wasn't some mistake there. And then you can look at summary statistics from other sources, like how much, what's the income in these different areas, or what's school enrollment, what diseases are common, and so forth, to see if it's consistent. Okay, so those are data checks you can do. And then you can, a lot of times you can create a total income variable or a total expenditure variable to use as a general measure of poverty or welfare, things like this. And you can compare that to previous surveys, whether it's similar or not. Okay. And then finally, all these changes that you make to the data based on after the data collection is over should be documented, and they should be written up so that everybody can see, there's going to be a raw data file before you do anything. And then there's going to be a kind of like clean data file after you make these changes. And so you need to have both files and a document that explains, or a program, a Stata do file that shows what you did to go from the raw data to the clean data. Yeah, right.
So in like a paper that you write up, often in the data section, it will say something like, we went to see 100 households and XYZ happened, and now we have 75 households. But there's all this detail.
Mm-hmm.
So typically, do you write up like an appendix section and then that doesn't make it into like the actual publication, or is this just for the researchers? This is not for publication.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if it's for publication, it would be like an online appendix. So I think that's kind of the way things are moving now, because people are putting very long online appendices that I'm not sure anybody really looks at them. But yes, things like that, like what happened? Why did we not get, all these households that we were supposed to get? Why did we get turned down? Yeah, you can write that up and explain that and put it in an appendix. Yeah.
Does this ever come up by like referees or things like that? Or they just are kind of accepting that you did primary data collection and it's messy?
No, I mean, you can, if, people referees can, say, look, this has so many problems that like, we just can't trust this data or something like this. So it can be like fatal to your paper if a lot of things go wrong. They're not going to say, oh, we know that's hard to do, No, I mean, there's so many people doing research now that, if things go bad, they can say, okay, we just can't use this. We got lots of other good papers to publish. So yeah, so that's going to be something that could knock out your paper trying to get it published. Okay, creating data files for analysis and dissemination. After everything is done, you can put this together. There's different ways of doing it. It's like when you're collecting general household surveys, the questionnaires are different topics like, income, education, health, farming firms. And so each of those sections would be like a separate data set with all the households in it. Because some people, aren't interested in some parts of the data, so they just want to use the sections. They don't want necessarily to have the whole data set. And then you merge them. Like you have the household roster section, which just lists the household members and their ages and gives them ID codes and stuff like that. And then you can merge into that the data that you're interested in. So a typical thing is to have multiple data sets, not one giant data set that's got everything in it. One, state of data set or something, but you merge them. Okay. So that's what that was about. Yeah. So just some other points here. There are some, variables that you create like total income or total expenditure, or if you collect height and weight data, as anthropometric data, you can calculate z-scores, your height for age or weight for height and things like that. And then you can make that available to the researchers and say, this is our official thing. And sometimes there's a wealth variable that people create using principal components or something like that. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, you want to make sure that all these separate data sets have ID codes, both like a household ID code, a person ID code, so that you can merge them together. Okay. Yeah, the levels of the data sets can matter. If it's a household ID, there's just one observation per household. Sorry. It's a household data set, like, housing characteristics, what kind of roof does this house have? What kind of toilet, where is the water source? It's just one observation per household. Other ones, it's one observation per person. So yeah, when you merge, you have to make sure you're merging by the right ID code there. Okay. Let's see. So you might, again, merge in other data sources from yours thing, and then you need to get those data sets ready. You may run into problems of confidentiality, like the government says, we're going to give you this data for you, but you can't send it to anybody else. Okay. Then you're not going to put it up in your publicly available data set. It's just like, hey, if you want this data, you gotta contact the government to see if they'll give it to you. Okay. And you see that a lot now in journal articles where they'll say, we use this data, but we're not free to provide it. And so we will help you. They say, I don't know if they do, but they say, we will help you, try to get it from whoever it is, the government office, if they're not going to make it publicly available. Okay. So then you may put these into like SATA, SAS data or whatever data files, making them available. Yeah, but there's lots of software to transfer from one type of data set to another. Okay, and then you need to write a document that kind of explains what data sets there are, and how all the created variables were made, things like this. And so that's all very useful. I mean, one way it's useful to write this document, although it seems like a very big burden at the time, is that if you've got a very interesting data set, people are going to be asking you about it. And instead of having to reply to individual people asking you, just send them this document and say, here, it's all in here. And that's everything I know is in there. And so don't bother me anymore. something like that. Okay, and then finally, you need to sort of store the data in some place. A lot of it could have personal identifying information, and there's lots of new sort of systems of securing data, which we don't really talk about in these slides because this is back. But to make sure, and then sometimes there is even rules that after a certain number of years go by, you have to destroy the data, which I find not very good idea, but some medical research does that, I think. So a few comments about this. Yeah, sometimes the funding agencies require you to make the data publicly available, so you have to put it somewhere. But there's lots of organizations that have it. I think like there's this Harvard Dataverse where you can put your data there. If you're doing something with maybe JPAL funding, you can put your data with them. There's lots of places to put it up, or you can just put it up in your own website or something. Okay. Yeah, you need to remove all the personal identifying information. Exactly what that is, certainly like a national ID code or social security number or the names or addresses, you take that out. But sometimes people even say you need to take out like what town this data was collected from, or what village, because that might help people find the people. Okay, so that will vary a lot depending on, sort of who's funding you and what country you're working in and so forth. Okay. Well, if you're really into, got a really great data set, you might even charge people a little bit of funding. This is really more for organizations, not for individual researchers, but you may want to charge a little money for people if you're an organization that gets, hundreds of data requests. And you also may want to publicize, again, if you're a big organization, making the data available to people so that it gets used. And then maybe you can even, in the country you're working with, if you want to be really, kind of helpful to them, set up a kind of a training course for using your data for local researchers. Okay. And finally, if the questionnaire is in a local language, translate it to more of an international language, English or French or Spanish, maybe Arabic, Russian, Chinese, so other people can use it. For example, the Young Lives questionnaire in Ethiopia has got 8 different languages because there's many different languages, but you can get an English translation because you probably are not going to know all those languages. Okay, I think that's it for this one. And so the next thing I need to do is the one more about field work. Okay, so let's see. This one. Do I need to do the full view thing?
Yeah.
Like read mode?
And then
Okay, and then share. Okay. All right. Where's the share one? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, that should be fine.
This
You
one.
see the full screen.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So now this is a separate one, but it's on a very related topic.
Paul?
Yep. Yes.
Maybe we'll talk about this in the survey management part.
Uh-huh.
And if you're working in a country with a lot of different dialects in different regions,
Uh-huh.
how do you to make sure that they
Oh, right. Yeah, that's a good point. So there could be multiple languages or multiple dialects where you're collecting data from. So it's important when you get your interviewers and train them that you select interviewers who speak these languages, usually from those areas and speak these dialects, so they can do that. And there's kind of, in some cases, you can use it's really not a matter of a different language with different, questions. It's more a matter, I guess like in China, you can write everything out in Chinese, but it's the written part is the same, but the dialects are different. But in other countries, you're really going to have multiple questionnaires in different languages to do this. Now, an example, and then sometimes you have make a choice. Like I was saying, the Young Lives questionnaire, they actually had 8 different same questionnaire in 8 different languages. But when I did a survey in Ghana a long time ago, we decided we're just going to have an English language questionnaire. We never translated it into any local languages. But the interviewers who knew English and the local language, they would make translation on the spot. I'm not sure that was the best thing. But it was kind of decided that it would be too hard to translate. So I know like DHS questionnaires, demographic and health surveys, I think they tend to translate into local languages more than the World Bank would do for these LSMS surveys. So there's a lot of kind of people do things differently. Yeah.
I have
Right.
a question online from
Oh.
Anna Melissa. Professor Paul, given the recent discoveries where more than 20 papers were using fake RCT data, they blamed the NGOs who collect the data. Was it a good idea to know that the people actually did the surveys? So I think she's asking with fraud with RCTs, and if you're in Minnesota and your thing's somewhere else, how do you know that things are happening?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you want to be there as much as possible, you know, like going out and watching the data collection and getting to know the people who are collecting the data. And I think the fraud this case is mostly happening in Bangladesh. And there's a particular person who actually is the one who invited me to Australia. But I haven't written any papers with him yet, and I don't think I am going to be writing papers with him. But yeah, to get to know the people and see what they're doing. And, you know, now there's so much being done in these countries that I think you can talk to other people who worked with local organizations, hopefully to they have an understanding of like which ones are you can trust and which ones you can't. But that's a very hard thing. But the ideal solution is that you spend as much time in the country watching all the data collection as you can. But that's not always an easy thing to do. You know, as a professor, I could like send graduate students out there to do that, or rely on what other people tell me. So that's a tricky thing, and all this is happening just in the last 2 months. But yeah, yeah, I think the more you're kind of involved in hands-on, the more you reduce that. But it's hard to do when you're half a world away from where you're collecting data. Okay, so let me go on with this. Sorry, I have to make this thing. Okay, yeah, survey management. Oops. Okay. So there's a lot of things to do with managing. You need to get a budget, you need a plan of activities, you need to hire people, you need to do all sorts of logistics, like, you know, maybe buying computers, in some cases, even buying vehicles, arranging transportation and so forth, community relations, you know, working with the different local areas where you're collecting data. So this kind of covers all that stuff. Budgeting, very kind of boring, but very important to do. Budgets have to, you know, pay for the personnel, like the interviewers and the supervisors and some like this, and also some managers that you may hire. Then there may be separate data entry personnel from the interviewers. You may have to hire drivers to take these people around, rent cars, or even buy vehicles. You may have to do insurance and training costs. Like usually the training could be like 2 to 3 weeks. You need to like rent a place to do the training and get food for the people for the training. There may be special data collection efforts, like sometimes if you're doing a health survey, you may want to draw blood from people, you know, or collect other things, do a little physical exam, and that you need special people to do that. So there's a lot of different things. Transportation, where there's vehicles, but then there's fuel and insurance, and then there's all kinds of equipment. If you're doing paper questionnaires, you need to get copies of them. You know, maybe you need to buy copiers. If you're using, you know, electronic devices, handheld things, or iPads or phones or something, and you need to give them laptops, or maybe also in the field, or computers in the central office. You may need to buy some software to do things. For communications, you need to buy cell phones, or at least give cell phone credit to people. And you need to make sure that the people in the field have money to buy food, and maybe pay for lodging, and maybe pay respondents if you're going to do that for their cooperation. And then you may have community meetings where you get the local leaders together and explain what you're doing. and may even interview them. You may interview local leaders, to ask about things in their community, okay? And then there's always unforeseen expenses. So a standard thing to do is whatever, when you're done with your budget, you add 10%, and you call that contingencies or something like that, okay? Okay, we're not going to do the discussion question here. So that's the budgeting. Then you need an overall plan of activities. So what you need to figure out is what personnel you need, how the training is going to be done, when it's going to be done, what kind of transportation, drawing a timeline from, the very beginning when you're doing pilot testing all the way through the end when you're sort of analyzing the data. Sometimes you may have to implement the survey at a certain time of the year. Like if I'm doing education stuff, I need to do it when the schools are in session. If you're doing agriculture, you may want to do it at times when the farmers are not so busy, have time to talk to you. And then you need to see whether all your plan is actually affordable given the budget you have. Okay. So I'll skip that hypothetical thing there. So here's just an example of a timeline. Okay. Where you have the months, on the left column here, and these are, all kinds of things that you do. This is relatively fast. Sometimes it'll take things longer. I think this goes on to the next page. Yeah, next page. So these are all these things that you need to do. So this is just an example, but you'll have to, modify these things. Okay, here's another way to do it. Do a timeline where you have a sort of matrix here where the time is the different columns there, and the activities are the rows. And so the blacked out parts are when is this going to happen? Okay. And obviously there's a big long line for like data collection and things like that. And then shorter things for like the pilot tests and so forth. So this is a useful way to set up a kind of plan of activities. Okay, I'm just kind of speeding along here. Here's an example of a budget. Ryan can make these slides available if you want to see these, where you put all these things in here, like how much you need of these things, how much they cost, and, get the total costs, so forth, and just fill this. Again, it's kind of boring, but you really need to do this. And if you're applying for money, to get funding, they're going to want to see a very detailed budget. Okay. Well, this budget continues on. There's more stuff in it. So again, you can take a look and see what it is. Okay. Then there's also just managing the survey, from the point of view of human resources, or just being the boss of everybody, or something like this. So there's kind of a big trade-off here. If you want to get the data quickly, you'll have to hire a lot of people, a lot of interviewers and other people to collect it quickly. But that is, has some cost to it. I mean, the more people you train, the harder it is. Well, you're going to probably, you can't select like the best people to do your work. You're going to have a lot of people, and the training is probably not going to be as good if you're training a large number of people and so forth. So the alternative is that, let's see. Yeah, okay. And this is actually another general point, which is that, there are gonna be people that you pick for your work, and then in the middle of it, they have to leave for some reason, they get sick, or there's some emergency, or something else happens. And so you really need to train more people than you're going to use. Okay. And what we've done a lot is that we have this training, and then at the end of the training, we kind of give people a test. And the ones who do the best are the ones we're going to start with. The ones who don't do so good, we kind of put them on standby, so that when the people we select, some of them have to leave, we have some people that we can pull in quickly to replace them. Okay. So that's a common thing to this. So now this is going to get maybe into more details than you want to see. What are the positions we talked about? A survey manager, a data manager. Ideally, if you've got a big budget, you can hire some, highly qualified people. So the survey manager should be a social scientist or statistician, the kind of statistician who collects data, not the kind who does, statistical theory or something like this. Okay. Or some kind of specialist in the area. They should ideally have a college degree. and hopefully a graduate degree. And this person makes a lot of decisions. It's kind of like you give them a lot of responsibility, and they, communicate with you and with the team. They're kind of like the link between you. They're the ones who, like, if the field, something going wrong in the field, the interviewers will they'll go up the chain to this person, and then they'll contact you. Okay. Then data manager, somebody who's got a lot of computer skills and experience and who's managed data before, very familiar with data entry software and so forth. And then a field manager is this person who's actually, making sure that all the interviewers and supervisors are getting out where the data collection is. This person would also go to the field to check on things, collect on, including checking the supervisors. And then the supervisors, I've mentioned before, they're the ones who are checking what the interviewers are doing. And they're out in the field a lot too. Okay, and then of course there's the interviewers. Obviously, well, ideally they should have at least secondary level education and maybe higher. They're the ones who are dealing with the households. Okay, and they're the biggest group of people in your whole data collection effort. Okay, and then there might be some specialized people. Anthropometrists are people who like get the height and weight of children and maybe of adults using special measuring equipment and things like this. I do a lot of education surveys, so sometimes we have specially trained people who are going to give tests in the schools who are different from interviewers. They don't have to be like highly, trained people. In fact, you probably will be training them, but they need to have at least a secondary education. And then if you have paper questionnaires that are going to be entered by some data entry operators, then that's another set of people that you'll need. And again, they should have some experience with data entry and so forth. Okay, some other things. You may we need to have kind of a more diverse staff, although maybe in these days that might get in trouble. But this relates to the issue that Ling raised about different dialects. You want to have people who speak different languages that are going to be able to communicate with the households where you're going, and men and women, different ethnic groups. There could be some security considerations, like there may be places where it's not safe for women to work, so only men can be there. On the other hand, there may be certain rules that only women can interview women or something like this, and so it can get very complicated. Okay, but you need to sort of think about the composition of the survey, and then. Yeah, if you're, short of money, it may be that the data manager and the field manager can be a single person. And then this, maybe that if you can't afford separate supervisors, you can make, in a group of interviewers, you can make one interviewer like the head interviewer who will also do supervisory activities. Okay, training. Well, again, you need to train people on what they're doing, and they need to be familiar with the questionnaires and the other things that they're using. And so again, it's a good idea to have more people trained than you need, so then you can test them at the end and keep the best ones and hold the other ones in reserve. So for a training course, there's kind of an initial orientation to, usually it's like even you may be the person who gives this little pep talk about why this is important, collect the data and so forth. And then the training itself, there could be practice interviewing. I mean, there's sort of a classroom phase, as I talked about, and there's going on in the field phase. In the classroom phase, you can do practice interviewers, this role-playing thing here. And then again, evaluating at the end, which are the best people and keep the best ones. Okay. Okay, logistics. There's a lot of logistical things that you need to keep track of. Transportation is a big one. Making sure if you're in charge of these vehicles that they're in good shape. Making sure you have money for fuel, and if the field teams are going to be out in the field for more than one day, they need to have lodging, meals, and so forth like this. You need to keep supplies going. If it's paper questionnaires, they need to be. If they're out there for a long time, you may need to send some new things. The electronic things can break down. You need to have extra ones that can be sent out quickly in case the iPad is not working. things like that. You may want to build in some extra time in the schedule for transportation or just team members becoming ill, other unforeseen things happening that may slow you down. And then you want to have really good communications by cell phone or email or things like this. Security, okay. Sometimes field work is risky depending on where you're working. So you need to think about sometimes, the simplest way to save money on transportation is just have people take local transportation. But in some cases, it may be dangerous, local transportation. And sometimes carrying, fancy equipment like laptops or expensive cell phones might make somebody a target for thefts or, robberies and maybe even violent, attacks or something. So you have to think about those kinds of possibilities. It varies a lot by country. And more generally, there could be crime in the areas. Is it safe to stay overnight in some place? Maybe some places it's not. Work with the local people to figure out how this works. What's the safe thing to do? Look for safe accommodations for the survey teams. And again, women especially may need, take more safety measures than men do. How can you do this? Especially if you need to have women because only they can interview women, in the household or whatever you're doing. So there's a lot of things to take in mind. Community relations. Basically, usually when you go somewhere, you need to talk to some, local leaders. Like if you're doing a school survey, you talk to the school principal and maybe even somebody higher above that is, is the boss of the school principal. If you're doing a household survey, you need to go and talk to the local leaders, especially in rural areas, tell them what you're doing, and get their cooperation. You may even interview them as part of the data collection. And you got to treat them well, otherwise they're not going to be very happy and cooperate them. Okay, so ideally, before you even go out there, send a letter or some other message, maybe by sending a text message or something, telling them this is what we're doing. We're doing this. Let us know if you have any questions. This is when we're going to come out. Things like that. And then when you get to the community, first go to these people. Don't start chasing households down or other people, but tell the people where you've arrived. Get their cooperation and so forth. And then you may provide additional information about the survey. They may take some time to answer their questions, if they have any, and then maybe introduce the survey personnel that are going to be working in that area, and then that should work very well. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, in some cases you may be recruiting local people to take you around. And also just the people you're collecting data from, you want to be respectful and not pressure them to participate. If they say, I don't want to do it, you just, maybe try one more time to be persuasive, but if you still don't want to do it, then that's it. They're not going to be interviewed. And then you might even give gifts to these local leaders to make them happy. I've seen even give them a bottle of alcohol or something that makes some people very happy. Okay, we don't want to do the discussion. Oh, informed consent. Yeah, if you're collecting data from people, you need often to have them sign forms. But in some countries, signing forms is gets you in trouble. So people don't want to sign forms. So it varies a lot by country. Most of the case, yeah, you will have a piece of paper. Yes, you read, explaining what's going on, and you say in this that you don't have to do this if you don't want to. You don't have to participate. But, we would really like it if you did. And if you're okay, ask me any questions. If you have any questions, finally, if you're okay, please sign this form. Okay. Yeah. So you have to, design these consent forms and so forth. Okay. The last part of this, so this gives you some quick examples of things that go wrong. Okay. First one is a paper I did on eyeglasses in China, where there were money for the eyeglasses, and it turned out that there was some leftover money. And so some of the teams, the eyeglass distributing people started giving eyeglasses to the control group. So that messed up about 1/3 of our sample. And actually 40% of the sample was lost because of this. And it's because they didn't really understand what was going on here, that we really needed a control group, okay? This is a survey I was involved in Jamaica, where it's just a mistake in the questionnaire, where the questionnaire asks people, like, did you get any of these food stamps in the past month? Okay. But the problem was the food stamps were given out every 2 months. So half the people who got the food stamps, if they got them in the previous month, and we say, did you get any food stamps this month? They would say no. So that was just a dumb mistake that should have been caught in the pilot testing, but wasn't caught. Okay. Preschools in Guatemala. This is one of my former students who was looking, and they had these waiting lists for these kids. Okay. And they were supposed to be assigned by lottery, but basically, there was some misunderstanding where families thought that they were going to get some financial benefits. And then when they didn't get those benefits, the families thought that the preschool teachers had stolen some money or goods, and so then they didn't cooperate. So that whole study just stopped. Okay. Something else I was involved in, collecting data on schools and households and students in Vietnam. I assumed that to match kids with schools, that they were all attending the schools in their village or their commune. Turned out it wasn't true. There were students who were attending schools in another commune. And so the code number they put down was for a different commune, but I thought it was for this commune. And so there was a lot of messy things that happened with that. This one, Brazil, I don't remember what it was. Okay. This was just a change in a school census. So in one year, they asked them, you participate, you get money from this program. The next year they said, do you get money from this particular program, the BOLSA program? So the data were not comparable over time. Okay. All right. So then finally, there's some references here, but these are all kind of old because this thing is old. They're mostly from World Bank. These are all sort of World Bank sources here. Okay. Okay. So that's it.